Thank you for those eloquent and powerful remarks. This is not the first time Lyons Award winners have not been able to accept the award in person. The first foreign journalist to win the award in 1982, South African journalist Joseph Theole, was one of them. Some research by Nieman staff and fellows have discovered that in 1987, 1995, and 2001, winners were also unable to be here. And I think there has even been one since.
In Tombstone, Yang Jisheng wrote, "The authorities in a totalitarian system strive to conceal their faults and extol their merits, gloss over their errors, and forcibly eradicate all memory of man-made calamity, darkness, and evil. For that reason, the Chinese are prone to historical amnesia imposed by those in power."
In place of Mr. Yang tonight, the Nieman Fellows have invited award-winning former China correspondent and academic Louisa Lim to give an address. Louisa Lim has covered China for both the BBC and NPR and is the author of The People's Republic of Amnesia about the 1989 events in Tiananmen Square. Professor Lim has met and interviewed Yang Jisheng on a number of occasions and additionally brings her own perspective to Chinese history. Professor Lim will take questions at the conclusion of her address. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Louisa Lim.
Thank you so much. It's such a tremendous honor to be asked to speak at a ceremony celebrating Yang Jisheng, who's one of my journalistic heroes and who has been a great inspiration to me. I'd like to start by thanking the class of 2016 for inviting me to speak here today, and also to thank Anne-Marie Lipinski, Samantha Henry, and everyone who made that possible. I'm also delighted that some people who worked on the English version of Tombstone are able to be here tonight, including Stacey Mosher, the translator, and Nancy Hurst from the H.C. Fung Library. And along with Guojian, Edward Freeman, and Roderick McFarker, who couldn't be here tonight, they gave the English-speaking world access to what had been a 950-page, 2-volume, gargantuan epic. So that's a huge task, and for that your readers, are so very grateful. When I was based in Beijing, I used to love visiting Yang Jisheng at his office. I always thought of it kind of like an act of time travel. At the time, he was working at Yanhuang Chunqiu, the Annals of the Yellow Emperor, which was a liberal magazine that made a point of running bold articles that contested the party version of history. And when you visited the office, the first thing you noticed was how old everybody was that worked there. The publisher at the time was coming on to his 90s, and Yang Jisheng, who was in his 70s, was something of a spring chicken in the office. The technology was ancient. When you opened the door, the first thing you saw was this very narrow corridor, which was lined waist deep with unsold copies of the magazine. And even the furniture was elderly, these great big solid brown desks. I noticed on one trip that I didn't see a single computer in the whole office when I was there. And in most of the offices, including Yang's, there were beds for the staff to have their midday naps. So the surroundings really felt like a throwback to another era. But the work that was done there is trailblazing. It's work that has rewritten history, work that has been perceived as so challenging to the authorities that last year the government banned the magazine from hosting its annual dinner. It's work that really underlines the difficulties of journalism in China. Last April, the magazine was given a list of 15 more topics that they were banned from writing about. These included things like important documents regarding the party and state, ethnicity and religion, military affairs and defense, important historical events in party history. So those notifications were, in addition to the normal taboos, sensitive topics like corruption and the current leadership, Tibet, Xinjiang, the Tiananmen crackdown, topics that all Chinese journalists know are completely untouchable. And Yang himself has said that only a fifth of the magazine's articles actually made it through the censors into print. Last year, Yang himself was forced to step down from his position at the magazine. Why? Well, he wrote in his farewell letter, "This is a magazine that tells the truth." And as journalists in so many countries around the world can attest, truth-telling can be a dangerous business, especially when you're challenging the authorities' narrative, their version of history. As George Orwell wrote in 1984, who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. Through his work, Yang Jisheng has brought to light an episode of history that the authorities would rather remain forgotten. And the enormity of his achievement was really made clear to me when I interviewed somebody else. It was a famous filmmaker whose name is Wu Wenguang, and he's involved in his own project where he's training young filmmakers to go back to their own villages and to shoot documentaries about the impact of the Great Famine in their own communities. So we were talking about Yang Jisheng, and Wu Wenguang said these words that stayed with me. He said, "Look at our universities. We have so many universities, and each one has so many history professors and academics. What are all these historians doing? Why is it that it took a journalist to dig out exactly what happened?" It's a good question. Why did it take a journalist? It took the persistence and resourcefulness of a reporter, the independence of spirit, the integrity, and the courage. Yang gave us the fullest account of an episode that was so unspeakable that it simply wasn't spoken about. Instead, it was wiped from party history and consequently from people's memories. In Tombstone, he wrote, "Human memory is the ladder on which a country and a people advance." So historical amnesia was a huge theme for him, and it was also a major theme for me in my book, The People's Republic of Amnesia, which is about how Tiananmen changed China and how China subsequently changed Tiananmen as it rewrote history. It rewrote its accounts of what happened and then subsequently expunged the whole episode from history. Like Yang, I was working in secret. I was living and working in a diplomatic compound widely believed to be bugged, so I never spoke about what I was doing at home or in my office. I never mentioned it on the telephone. I never emailed about it. I didn't even tell my children for months. And I wrote everything on a laptop that had never been online, that I kept locked in a safe in my bedroom at night. And I became increasingly paranoid. And whenever I did feel nervous, I would think about Yang Jisheng, about how he had spent a decade working in secret. And I would think about how much higher the stakes are for Chinese journalists and for our Chinese sources than they are for us foreigners. This award is for ambitious and fearless reporting, and well before Tombstone, Yang showed these qualities. Actually, in 2004, he published a book on political reform, and if I was to pick one word to describe that book, I'd say gutsy. It included transcripts of conversations that he had secretly recorded with the disgraced party leader Zhao Ziyang while Zhao was under house arrest. It included the only interview that has ever been published with a general who refused to obey the orders for martial law and send troops to Tiananmen Square. And it also contained details of Yang's eyewitness account of what happened on the night of June the 3rd to June the 4th in Beijing. He had been in Wuxidi, where the worst bloodshed had happened, and he'd watched as the tanks rolled in. He'd seen people shot beside him, and he himself went to 4 hospitals to count the corpses. When I asked him whether he'd been scared, he said, "I didn't dare be afraid. History was exploding before my eyes, and I needed to record it for posterity." When it came to the question of whether to publish the book, he weighed up the risk, and he knew the risk was substantial. He calculated it could be up to 3 years in prison. So he rang up his family members, he warned them that he might face prison time, and he still published. When I was researching my book, I thought an awful lot about Yang's work because I too had stumbled across a story that hadn't really been told before. In my case, it was the story of a second deadly crackdown in 1989, not in Beijing, but 1,000 miles away in the city of Chengdu. And I tracked down eyewitnesses who had been there, who had seen people being beaten to death before their eyes. But I knew that I needed more, so I too was trawling archives, but in the safer compounds of American university libraries and online, and diplomatic cables from overseas. But I also found some of the proof that I needed in the Communist Party's own writings, in local government documents admitting that people had died in Chengdu. 8 people, they said, and 1,800 people injured. And I realized that this, too, was an event that had been collectively forgotten, even though it had happened in living memory. Had it not been for the existence of its own archives, its own propaganda, this would also have been the perfect case study of the Communist Party's ability to rewrite history. And when I was researching my book, I was surprised to find that even the events that had happened in Beijing, that we know in the West so well, have been forgotten in China. I did this experiment where I took the iconic photograph of Tank Man, the young man in his white shirt and black trousers, holding 2 shopping bags, standing in front of a column of tanks as they trundled down the Avenue of Everlasting Peace. I took that to 4 university campuses in Beijing, and I asked 100 students if they could identify this picture. And if they said yes, I asked them what it was and where it was taken. And I was surprised to find that only 15 out of 100 students knew what it was. It was also surprising to me how obvious it was, those who knew and those who didn't. The vast majority, the 85 who didn't know, they would look at the picture, they would lean in, and they would ask me questions. They would ask, is it South Korea? Is it Kosovo? Some asked, is it a military parade? In fact, 19 students asked me if it was a military parade, more than those that actually knew what it was. Whilst the power of that picture is so visceral that people who didn't know what it was, who did know what it was, who recognized it, would literally shy away from the picture. They would gasp. They would say, one young man says, I don't know what it is, but it's too sensitive and I can't talk about it. So it was really interesting to me, not only how deep that forgetting goes, but also I realized when I was doing this, how much I myself had internalized the kind of censorship that pervades the media environment in China. Even though I had a journalist card literally in my back pocket that gave me license to go around asking me these questions, I became convinced that I would be detained. I was incredibly nervous. And I realized how difficult it is to break these taboos when they are so long-standing. I also realized just how hard it is to remember in China, and remembering certain episodes of history like the Great Famine or 1989, because there is no benefit to remembering. Indeed, the costs and the dangers of remembering are apparent. And in this way, Chinese people have been co-opted into silence, and history is forgotten. A year after I did that experiment, actually, a French camera crew tried to do the same thing. They went out on the streets with the Tank Man picture, and they started asking people what it was. Within 10 minutes, they were detained, and they spent 6 hours under interrogation, and they were warned that their visas could be revoked. This example just shows the kind of gray area that journalists operate in China. Every story involves some kind of calculation, an impossible calculation, weighing up risks and consequences. It's like juggling balls in the dark because there's such a void of information. You know, subjects that were fine one day, suddenly they're completely untouchable. Places that were accessible become closed off. Sometimes whole swathes of the country, like Tibet and Xinjiang, are closed for years. No one tells you that you've crossed the line until it's too late. And that ambiguity breeds fear. And that fear breeds self-censorship and silence. In recent years, foreign journalists have had visas denied, they've been expelled, they've had state media campaigns mounted against them, and 3/4 said their reporting had been hindered. But the situation for Chinese journalists is far worse. China is the world's biggest jailer of journalists worldwide. 1/4 of the 199 journalists in prison are in Chinese jails. And China ranks 176 out of 180th in the World Press Freedom Index. Over the last few years, there's been a whole raft of new legislation aimed at muzzling the press in China. New cybersecurity and national security laws mean almost everything is a matter of national security, including politics, finance, culture, the environment, food safety, and religion. Regulations in 2014 barred journalists from releasing information from interviews online without permission from their employers. Internet censorship has been tightened. One recent report, leak from a censor, said 10,000 words were banned as search terms on Weibo, the Chinese version of Twitter. And I mean, we can see this because of the kind of words that are banned. When it comes to June the 4th, the words that are banned include things like May the 35th, then today, tomorrow, that year, that day. Nostalgia was a banned word. The phrase when spring turns to summer was banned. And at one point, even the word sensitive word became a sensitive word. We're seeing online public opinion guidance, paid commentators, zombie Twitter accounts, a program of selective censorship unprecedented in recording world history, according to Gary King, who studies it here at Harvard. The Chinese internet is becoming an intranet policed by fiat, where old-school propaganda tools have been rebooted for the digital age. And we're also seeing efforts to control speech extending beyond China's borders. A fifth of foreign correspondents in China last year complained that they were being subject to pressure placed on their employers by embassy officials overseas. And Chinese journalists are seeing, again, worse. One example is Charlotte Hosher from RFA, who's based here in the US, but has had 3 brothers jailed in China on anti-state charges. So journalism is really facing an existential crisis in today's China. The assault on freedom of expression and freedom of information is of a magnitude that hasn't been seen for decades. And it's really epitomized in this series of televised confessions that we've seen on the nightly news in China. We've seen journalists admitting to stealing state secrets. We've seen journalists admitting to triggering market chaos, bloggers confessing to soliciting sex workers, a British private investigator saying he had obtained private information about individuals, and the recent case of 5 Hong Kong booksellers who disappeared, in some cases in Thailand and Hong Kong, and resurfaced in China, admitting to illegal book trading. In this way, the state-run media is being transformed into a kangaroo court. And with each new confession, the unthinkable becomes mundane and banal even. In this kind of environment, self-censorship is a survival tactic. And even the Communist Party elite in recent weeks have begun breaking ranks to express their concern at the muzzling of the media. This climate has not left Yang Jisheng unscathed. His work is under new attack from famine deniers, and even the very act of accepting this prize has left him open to criticism. A recent symposium of academics leveled the following accusations at him, and I will quote their words: that he is being used by hostile forces, that he is a traitor, scum, that his work has caused greater damage than bribery or corruption, that he deserves to be expelled from the party, that he deserves disciplinary action, and that this prize will be his death sentence. So why am I repeating these words? Well, when I look back through our conversations, one of Yang Jisheng's favorite phrases, he liked to talk about people saying what needs to be said. And I think these accusations do need to be said to fully convey the landscape that Chinese journalists now navigate. In Yang's case, saying what needs to be said means refusing to self-censor, refusing to collude in silence, knowingly taking moves that might make you a target, and not turning away from history exploding before your eyes. And today, we salute Yang Jisheng for not daring to be afraid, for showing us the meaning of journalistic integrity, and for saying what needed to be said. Thank you.